Okay, so next we will again be moving to another area of consideration around those policy levers, and I'd like to invite Mitch Shannon to speak to us from Pollination to talk about research and development, innovation, and the opportunities. How does Australia compare to other parts of the world as a centre of excellence for R&D and innovation, and what could we do to actually enable us to leverage some of our brilliance here as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Monica. Can you see my screen?
Yes, that's great.
Thank you. And so Hudson has already stepped through kind of some of the international policy comparisons with respect to the built environment and embodied carbon specifically. As Monica said, I'm going to be speaking a bit more broadly in terms of how to drive investment into innovation and R&D in the climate solutions area. So just to introduce myself briefly, my name's Mitch. I'm from a director at Pollination, and for those who haven't come across us, Pollination is a specialist climate and nature focused advisory and investment firm. So we help clients across a range of sectors navigate the transition to net zero and look to unlock opportunities for capital to flow into climate solutions across a range of areas. And this piece of work that we did, as I said, was primarily looking at how Australia compares to other countries in relation to policy settings for innovation and R&D. So just at a high level, the process we went through for this analysis was to come up with some metrics to actually select what other countries we wanted to look at and compare Australia to based on who performs strongly in relation to investment in innovation and R&D in the climate space specifically. Come up with a policy framework against which we could assess those countries and Australia's performance in a policy sense. Then undertake a review of both what the actual policy settings are in our peer countries as well as in Australia, with a view to really identifying what works well with respect to innovation and R&D policy elsewhere, again, specifically in a decarbonisation and climate solution context. And then in light of that, what are some of the gaps that we see in the Australian policy landscape, and how can those be best addressed, with a view to really coming up with some tangible policy recommendations to make Australia a more attractive investment environment for innovation in relation to climate solutions. So in terms of who we looked at for this analysis, we came up with a few metrics that we thought would be a good indicator for which countries perform strongly with respect to investment in innovation. And we've got 4 categories on the slide here, which informed our assessment and selection of the countries. The first is really where is venture capital investment flowing in terms of locations around the world in the climate space. And so you can see the sources for these rankings on the slide here. So that was based on some PwC analysis in the State of Climate Tech report. We also thought it was important to consider where the market value and the shareholder value that's created by companies operating in the sort of low carbon ecosystem and where those companies are located. And so we took the S&P Global Clean Energy Index and looked at the weighting of the companies in that index between different countries. Demonstration projects and investment in these projects is also, I think, an important outcomes-based metric to consider when you're looking at which countries are performing strongly. And there's limited data on that across the whole kind of low carbon or clean energy space. And so we looked specifically at hydrogen demonstration projects as a bit of a proxy for investment in early stage climate technologies more broadly, noting there's a little bit of a geographical bias towards certain countries in that regard. But again, it seems like a relatively useful proxy based on the data that's available. And then also looked at corporate patent applications in relation to low carbon energy and technologies to get a sense of where companies are looking to commercialize emerging technologies based on patent applications in that context. And so based on looking across those metrics, there were a number of countries that performed consistently quite strongly. and we wanted to have some industrial and geographic diversity in what we were looking at. And so we landed on Germany, the Netherlands, South Korea, Denmark, and California as the countries that we assessed in comparison to Australia in relation to innovation and R&D settings. Again, we had to have some sort of policy framework against which to assess these peer countries in Australia in this context. And so this is a relatively simplistic framework, but looking essentially at two major categories of policy settings, one around the resource push side, through which governments can set clear signals and priorities to give investors confidence through long-term and stable climate policy, mobilizing funding into emerging technologies through various financing mechanisms that governments can put in place, and then developing human capital and the environment to build the right capabilities and skills for people to work in these areas and attract talent so that we can have a strong human capital and labor base to build these industries on. And then on the market pull side, it's really around enabling markets through short and long-term mechanisms that create demand and build a market for emerging technologies. So that can be through a range of mechanisms like subsidies, product standards, again, carbon pricing mechanisms ideally. And then also looking at the role of government in kind of the broader business innovation environment. And that's really can take a number of forms, but essentially how can governments support particularly new businesses or businesses looking to innovate and build new technologies by reducing red tape and administrative burden, playing more of a coordinating role between different parts or different actors in the innovation environment. So taking that framework and some research and analysis of what has been done elsewhere, that allowed us to compare Australia's performance to some of these other leading countries in relation to policy settings. This is kind of an indicative visual way of representing some of the findings. But I guess one thing to note is that for each of these countries that we looked at, there's a very long and comprehensive and cohesive set of policies that they have in place across that push and pull framework to drive investment in innovation and R&D, and particularly in comparison to the Australian policy settings. And I should say a lot of this analysis was done in the context of the policy settings that were in place up until the election. But we've got some examples here, and you can see from the matrix that essentially all of these countries have kind of a strong balance between push and pull policies in relation to innovation and R&D, and kind of push up towards the more deep and comprehensive end of the policy spectrum compared to Australia in this context. And what we did note with Australia is that there are a few different push policies in place through different institutions and frameworks. But on the pull side of the equation, in terms of creating markets and demand for new products, was a relative underperformer compared to some of these other countries. And just to give a brief sense, we have some examples on the slide here of what was observed elsewhere. Again, this is a very condensed list compared to what we saw in the research. But essentially on the pull side of the matrix, there's the key mechanisms. Each of these jurisdictions that we looked at had some form of robust carbon pricing in place, and also subsidies for emerging technologies was a consistent theme across these different countries. And there's certain places like Germany where that's been a very well documented success story to drive the adoption and cost reductions in renewable energy technologies in particular. And then on the push side of the equation, something that was quite evident was that there's been very long-term, stable and structured policy frameworks in place in these countries, insofar as it relates to innovation and R&D in the energy and climate solution space. And a lot of these governments have developed very kind of comprehensive economy-wide frameworks that set out very clearly the R&D priorities for the country over particular timeframes, and those tend to be updated on a periodic basis, so that there's a very kind of structured approach to investment and policy settings for R&D in this space. The other thing that was evident is that other governments tend to be quite active in mobilising funding for particularly earlier stage technologies. And so that kind of unlocks more available capital for technologies at the earlier stage of the commercialisation phase compared to what we typically see in Australia. So some key themes emerging from all of this, and I touched on some of this in the previous slide, so I won't labour on it too much, but there's 5 sort of key things that we observed which were being done well in countries that are leading in this space. Having really consistent and stable policy settings that provide confidence to investors and certainty around what government's priorities are over time with respect to climate solutions. Appropriate balance between push and pull policies so that governments are helping to drive demand for new products and new industries, while also deploying resources to help meet that demand. Having a really clear set of industrial development priorities was something that's quite evident in many countries. And so we often hear this mantra of government not picking winners or being technology neutral. But we actually saw that other countries have had some success by really honing in on particular industries where they see economic opportunities or a strong imperative to decarbonise based on their own social or economic needs. Again, having more public capital at risk available for early stage technologies or companies that are seeking to develop and commercialise climate solutions is something that is typically done more robustly in other countries than in Australia. And this point around creating the enabling environment for innovation. So that can be through building infrastructure like EV charging networks or hydrogen pipelines, government being that kind of connective tissue between researchers and businesses and government and NGOs to help kind of commercialize new technologies and identify collaboration opportunities. And one example of that is that in both Germany and South Korea, they actually have government departments that are specifically dedicated towards facilitating technology and market disruption and supporting the development of small and medium-sized businesses that are seeking to undertake innovative activities. Conscious of the time, so I'll just touch on this quickly, but I guess the gaps in the Australian context are probably reasonably evident from that analysis. The most obvious one, I think, is the lack of kind of durable and stable policy over the past decade, and I'm sure we all understand why that's been the case here. But also policy effectiveness, in that we do have some existing policy frameworks in place that are quite good foundations for driving innovation and R&D, but haven't necessarily been utilised effectively. The safeguard mechanism and ERF being kind of potential examples of that. Again, a relative lack of demand creation policies to really create markets for some of these new technologies to flourish compared to other countries. Not really having a clear set of industrial development priorities for the country, although we have these kind of various national strategies in different areas. They're a little bit disaggregated and don't necessarily directly tie to what the innovation and R&D priorities are in that context. And having more funding at risk for small enterprises and earlier stage technologies to help provide financing pathways through to the market for those technologies. So in that light, there's a few recommendations that we can make across these different areas. And I won't go through each of these in detail, but essentially they're around establishing more durable policy settings, which hopefully we're starting to see with the legislation of climate targets here. But beyond that, really having a coordinated national planning system for industrial development and innovation and R&D in that context, and also important to consider the coordination between state and federal policy in that setting. Another theme is really clearly sorry, was that a question?
No, we'll just mute that person. That's fine.
Push on.
Yep.
A theme here also is clearly assigning responsibility to different institutions or actors within government for kind of coordinating innovation and R&D policy and executing on that. Strengthening existing policy mechanisms. Again, there's a range of recommendations I think that will emerge through the safeguard mechanism consultation on ways that framework could be used to incentivize industrial companies to innovate, excuse me, in their own operations to decarbonize. We've touched on national technology priorities, and I think the technology investment roadmap, again, could be a good platform for the development of an industrial innovation and decarbonisation strategy, and the built environment and embodied carbon can be a key part of that. Expanding the mandate of some of our existing financing bodies like CFC and ARENA so that they can provide capital for earlier stage technologies and companies, and ideally expand the risk appetite that they operate with at the moment so that they can support innovation more directly. And as we've touched on through a few of the presentations, government's role in technology validation, providing at-risk public capital through things like green procurement, for example, are really important actions to allow government to play a more direct and stronger role in funding for early stage climate solutions. So I'll stop there. That was kind of a high level overview of the key findings and themes from our research in this space. And I think, again, obviously is broadly related to innovation and R&D, but I think all of those themes and recommendations also apply specifically to innovation in the embodied carbon and built environment space.